What would you do if someone ordered you to remove the very symbol of honor you nearly died to earn, right in the middle of a courtroom, in front of people who had no idea what it cost you to wear it? This isn't just a story about war, and it's more than just a legal hearing. It's the moment an entire nation was forced to confront how it treats the quiet men who gave everything to protect it. A black veteran walked into court to testify in a simple civil case. But when the judge demanded he take off his Silver Star medal, what happened next shook the room, ended a career, and changed how the country sees honor forever. This is a story about dignity, silence, and awakening. And by the end, you may never look at a quiet old soldier the same way again. Watch until the end, because sometimes the most powerful statement is the one made without a single word. The courtroom in downtown Atlanta was unusually packed for a Monday morning. Outside, traffic buzzed and construction cranes loomed in the distance. But inside, Department 12B of Fulton County Courthouse, not a soul stirred. Not because of the civil case at hand, a dispute over access rights to a gentrifying alleyway in a historically black neighborhood, but because of a name on the witness list, Nathaniel Brooks. Whispers had filled barbershops and Baptist pews all weekend. They said the man was coming. The man. Nobody needed to say more. When he entered through the side door, the temperature in the room dropped. Not with coldness, but with weight. He wasn't tall, he wasn't broad. He didn't walk with theatrical limp or carry any visible air of ego. He wore an old navy blue blazer, wrinkled at the elbows, and shoes polished by habit, not vanity. But what silenced the shuffling papers and idle chatter was the medal on his chest, a silver star, gleaming not with polish, but with time. Some people in the gallery adjusted in their seats, some straightened their posture. Others, mostly younger, looked at the medal and then quickly Googled what it meant. Valor, combat, heroism. Very few had ever seen one in person. Fewer still knew what it cost. At the bench sat Judge William Carter, white, 62, a stern face carved by 2 decades of rulings and a jawline that had never once cracked a smile in court. He was a stickler for courtroom procedure, proud of having worked his way up, despite whispers about the political string-pulling behind his appointments. He didn't salute the flag so much as demand that others do so properly. And today, from the moment he saw Nathaniel Brooks enter, he frowned, not at the man himself, but at the medal. When court was called to order and the clerk read the docket, Judge Carter sat forward. His eyes pinned the veteran before a word had been spoken. "Nathaniel Brooks," the bailiff called. The old man stood slowly, with the controlled grace of someone who had learned long ago not to rush any movement. His hands were steady, but his shoulders carried the weight of more than age. He made his way to the stand. That's when it happened. Before any oath, before any question, before even a greeting. The judge leaned forward, and in a voice that sliced through the tension like a cold knife, said, "Before we begin, Mr. Brooks, take off that medal. This is a courtroom, not a veterans' parade." The silence that followed was not empty. It was dense. You could feel it settle into people's lungs. A woman in the back row audibly gasped. One of the attorneys blinked twice, uncertain if he had just witnessed a misunderstanding or something far uglier. The silver star glinted under the fluorescent lights, unaware of the insult hurled its way. Nathaniel didn't flinch. He looked directly at the judge, not defiantly, not submissively, but with something older than both: endurance. The judge shifted. Perhaps he had expected immediate compliance, perhaps an apology, even a flustered explanation. But the stillness in Nathaniel's face unnerved him. "I won't repeat myself," Carter said, sharper this time. "Remove the medal or you will not be permitted to speak before this court." It was clear. This wasn't about rules. It was about dominance, and it was happening in full view. Nathaniel slowly raised his right hand, reached for the back of the pin, and with a movement almost sacred in its slowness, unfastened the silver star. He placed it on the wooden ledge beside the microphone, not as if laying down metal, but as if laying down memory, carefully, quietly, reverently. He then sat, folding his hands in his lap, eyes fixed forward, not on the judge, not on the attorneys, but somewhere far beyond this room. Perhaps a jungle clearing in Vietnam, perhaps a hospital tent, perhaps a friend who never made it home. The medal sat beside the microphone, out of place, out of context, out of respect. The judge, satisfied, leaned back and gestured briskly. "You may proceed." An attorney shuffled his notes, voice shaky as he began the formal questioning. But the questions about easement access, dates, surveys were meaningless now. No one in the room cared about property lines. They cared about what had just been removed. Not just the metal, but the dignity that came with it. From the gallery, an elderly black couple whispered prayers beneath their breath. A teenage boy stared open-mouthed, phone forgotten in his lap. And still, Nathaniel Brooks remained unmoved, answering questions with precise, unembellished clarity. But nothing in that room, not even the law, could silence what had just happened. And far in the back, unnoticed until now, a man in full army dress uniform adjusted in his seat. His chest bore a single badge that outshone even the silver star. But that moment would come later. For now, the room held its breath, because something sacred had just been stripped without a fight. And it was not over. Nathaniel Brooks sat with his hands folded neatly in his lap, the overhead lights casting long, sterile shadows down his weathered face as the courtroom shifted restlessly around him, trying to adjust to the gravity that had just fallen across it like a storm cloud. He did not look at the judge again, nor at the attorneys. His gaze stayed fixed on a point past the wall ahead of him, as though he were seeing something that no one else in the room could see, something only known to men who had stared death in the eye and walked away with someone else's blood on their boots. The silver star lay cold beside the microphone, not shining anymore, just resting there, as though it too had been silenced. The attorney cleared his throat and tried to proceed, but his voice came out thinner than before, his questions now procedural and hollow in contrast to what everyone had just witnessed. "Mr. Brooks, can you state your name and occupation for the record?" Nathaniel blinked slowly and said, "Nathaniel Isaiah Brooks, retired. Former Staff Sergeant, 1st Air Cavalry Division, United States Army, helicopter crew chief, aircraft mechanic." The last few words delivered not with bravado, but like items checked off a casualty list, his voice low, gravelly, the tone of a man who has been asked to explain who he is far too many times, and always finds the answer smaller than the truth. "Were you present on the property the day in question?" "Yes." "Did you have permission to be there?" "Since 1989, given by the previous owner, Ronald Marks." "Why would he give you such access?" Nathaniel paused, not for memory, but for air, for the weight of what came next. "Because his brother died under my chopper," he said, and before he passed, he made Ronald promise to look after me like a brother. And that sentence, plain, quiet, but laced with irreversible grief, hung in the courtroom like smoke from a battlefield. No one said anything for a beat too long, until even the stenographer blinked back a tear she couldn't account for. The attorney nodded, murmured, "No further questions at this time," and stepped back, almost relieved. The judge barely looked up, muttering, "Is the witness finished?" But opposing counsel stood, tall, young, polished in a navy suit too crisp for the occasion, and approached with a practiced smirk, asking, "Mr. Brooks, would you agree that after so many years, memories might fade or become exaggerated?" And for the first time, Nathaniel turned to face someone fully since the moment he entered, his eyes locking on the lawyers with the stillness of a loaded chamber. His answer calm, sharp, surgical. "I remember every name of the men who didn't make it out," he said. "They come to me at night, not fading, not changing, just watching." And suddenly that lawyer was the one who looked away. The room remained silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning overhead and the muffled shuffle of a spectator crossing their legs in the gallery. But under the surface, something had begun to churn, a slow, rolling shift in mood and perception, like a tide just starting to turn. Nathaniel was excused from the stand with a brisk nod, but as he stood and turned, he did not pick up the silver star. He left it there. And in that small act, a second, deeper silence fell across the room, because that metal wasn't just metal, it was memory. And he had left it behind not because he forgot it, but because it no longer belonged in a room that had dishonored its meaning. And then it happened. From the back of the courtroom, a single movement cut through the tension like a razor's edge. A man in full U.S. Army dress uniform stood up slowly, his posture straight, his face unreadable, his shoulders squared with the type of weight only earned, never given. No one had noticed him until that moment, seated in the corner like a shadow. But now, he was unmistakable. His chest bore a row of ribbons that shimmered beneath the fluorescent lights, and at the center, unmistakably, sat the Medal of Honor. Gasps spread in quiet waves as eyes turned, necks craned, and phones were suddenly lifted to record what instinctively felt like history in motion. The man's voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it didn't need to be. Authority doesn't require volume. "Your Honor," he said evenly, "may I speak?" And the effect of those 4 words was immediate. Judge Carter froze, mouth slightly open, squinting as if trying to place a name he wasn't ready to remember, and the room seemed to hold its breath as though something larger than legal precedent had just entered the frame. "This is highly irregular," the judge stammered, "unless you've been subpoenaed or our legal counsel." But the man cut him off without raising his voice. "I am neither," he said, "but I served 3 tours in Iraq, 2 in Afghanistan, and I've earned the right to speak when a war hero is humiliated in front of his community." And though the judge opened his mouth to object again, no words came out. The authority in the room had shifted, and everyone felt it. Every attorney, every juror, every observer. It was no longer the judge who held the room's attention. It was this man, this soldier, who had come not for vengeance or drama, but for truth. And what came next would be remembered far beyond the courtroom walls. But for now, Nathaniel Brooks remained still, eyes forward, back straight, hands loose at his sides. Not defiant, not broken, just a man who had already survived worse, and who understood that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is leave something sacred behind and wait to see who dares to pick it up. The man in the army dress uniform stood with his hands behind his back, not moving forward, not raising his voice, just being present, and yet his presence alone shifted the temperature of the courtroom. Every head was turned now. Every eye, even those who minutes ago were distracted by phones or legal documents, were locked on him. The air inside the room had changed. Even the judge, perched high above in his bench, with a nameplate that read, "Judge William Carter," could feel it. This wasn't his courtroom anymore, not in spirit. The man who had just spoken was General Marcus Ellison, a name some recognized only when the ribbons on his chest caught the light. The Medal of Honor, highest distinction in the United States military, sat beneath the seal of the Republic like a silent gavel of its own. Judge Carter tried to recover control. "General Ellison," he began, though he hadn't been told the name, "this court respects your service, but we operate under rules. If you are not part of this case—" "I am part of this case," the general replied, voice calm but unyielding. "I was part of it the moment this man's medal was called a distraction. I was part of it the moment honor was treated like noise in this room." He paused, not for drama, but to let the weight of his words land properly. That man, Nathaniel Brooks, once crawled through burning wreckage in Quang Tri province to pull out 3 men from a helicopter crash. One of them was me. I owe him my life. The courtroom didn't erupt. It froze. Even the judge blinked, caught between instinct and uncertainty. The room was no longer a chamber of law. It had become a place of reckoning. "I sat in the back today," Ellison continued, "not as a decorated officer, but as a man who owed a debt. I wasn't sure I needed to speak. I thought the room might recognize him. I thought the law would protect him. I was wrong." He glanced briefly at the judge, but not with hostility. It was more disappointment than challenge. "You asked him to remove his silver star. Do you understand what that is? That medal isn't jewelry. It's not ceremony. It's memory. It's blood. It's the weight of people who didn't come back." Nathaniel had not moved. His eyes remained forward, his hands still relaxed in his lap, but something shifted in his jaw, just slightly. General Ellison stepped forward slowly now, his boots clicking softly against the courtroom tiles. He approached the witness stand, not in defiance, but with the solemnity of a funeral procession. He reached out and picked up the silver star, not with a snap or a dramatic gesture. He held it as if it were a human life. He turned and faced the room. "This," he said, holding the medal for all to see, "is not for decoration. It is a grave marker that happens to shine." There was no reaction from Judge Carter, but the rest of the room absorbed it like scripture. The public gallery was dead silent, but you could feel the burn of eyes and the pounding of hearts. General Ellison turned now to Nathaniel, still seated. "You didn't remove it," he said quietly. "You surrendered it. And that's what makes this moment so painful, because a courtroom should be the last place a soldier has to surrender anything again." For the first time since entering the courtroom, Nathaniel stood. Not fast, not slow, simply with the deliberate grace of a man who only stands when it matters. The 2 men looked at each other, and the weight of decades passed between them. Decades filled with war, recovery, memory, and silence. Then they embraced, not performatively, Not for effect. Just two men, two brothers in arms, in a room that had forgotten what that meant. When they pulled apart, Nathaniel held the silver star in his hand, but did not pin it back on. He didn't need to. Its meaning had been restored, not by law, but by memory. And then something truly remarkable began. One by one, members of the public gallery stood. A middle-aged woman in church attire stood quietly and placed her hand over her heart. A younger man, clearly a veteran by the tattoos on his forearm, removed his cap and held it to his chest. Another, an elderly white man in suspenders, simply nodded and stood, arms at his sides. There was no music. No announcement. Just quiet acknowledgement that something sacred had occurred. Judge Carter, still seated at his bench, looked smaller by the second. His voice, once commanding, seemed to shrink inside his throat. "This is highly irregular," he muttered, trying to reclaim the rhythm of procedure. But the courtroom no longer responded to his authority. Authority had changed hands. General Ellison turned to face the judge. "You've embarrassed a war hero in front of his community," he said, "in front of his countrymen. That decision will follow you, not because we'll chase you, but because truth follows silence." The general nodded once to Nathaniel, then turned and walked back toward the gallery. He didn't wait for a response. He didn't need permission to exit. And as he passed each row, more people stood until the entire courtroom was on its feet. Not clapping, not cheering, just standing silently, as if to say, "We see you, Mr. Brooks. We see you now." And the judge, Judge William Carter, who had once believed in power through order, sat frozen, surrounded by silence. And for the first time in 20 years on the bench, he realized that there are some things law cannot command, and dignity will not bow to. Nathaniel Brooks did not speak as the courtroom slowly began to exhale, as the standing crowd quietly settled back into their seats, as General Ellison took his place once more at the rear, like a sentinel who had fulfilled his duty. The judge, flushed beneath his robes, tried to clear his throat, but the sound came out brittle and uncertain, the usual gavel resting on his bench now seeming smaller, lighter, less capable of restoring order than it ever had before. The attorneys on both sides sat still, unsure whether the trial would continue or if they had all just witnessed the true verdict of the day rendered not by legal argument but by collective conscience. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably, waiting for a signal that didn't come. And in that suspended moment, it was Nathaniel who quietly stepped down from the witness stand, not looking at the judge, not acknowledging the lawyers, not even glancing at the silver star, now held respectfully in his own hand. He simply walked with the same calm, worn dignity with which he had entered, returning to the gallery as though he had never been on the stand at all, as if he were not the fulcrum around which the entire room had tilted. He sat, hands resting on his knees, the medal placed gently in his lap, and finally he exhaled, the first full breath he had taken since the moment he had been ordered to remove his legacy from his chest. The judge straightened and tried to continue, his voice forced into a semblance of authority. "Let the record reflect that the testimony of Mr. Brooks has concluded," he said, but even his court reporter hesitated before typing, her hands slightly trembling as if afraid to enshrine what had just happened in official ink. The opposing attorney stood again, his notes clutched in hand, but his confidence cracked, like a porcelain mug still warm but spiderwebbed from impact. He opened his mouth to resume cross-examination, but thought better of it, instead nodding slightly and saying, "No further questions, Your Honor," in a voice far smaller than the one he had begun the day with. And just like that, the legal proceeding stumbled on. The next witness called, the next motion entered, but the soul of the room had left its seat, trailing behind Nathaniel Brooks like the echo of a bugle in the aftermath of war. What no one realized yet was that outside those walls, something had already started. A clerk seated near the back, unnoticed until now, had recorded the moment General Ellison stood up. Though courtrooms prohibited formal filming, no rule had stopped her from discreetly opening the camera on her phone and catching the most explosive 47 seconds of moral reckoning she'd ever seen. And within 20 minutes of leaving the courthouse, the clip was uploaded. No filters, no music, no editing. Just raw footage of a black veteran being ordered to remove his silver star and a Medal of Honor recipient, rising to shut it down. The internet did the rest. Within hours, it spread to veterans forums, news blogs, Reddit, and then mainstream platforms. Captions varied. Some said, "Judge silences war hero." Others, "General destroys judge in courtroom." but the content was the same, and the impact was electric. The clip reached 10,000 views in 2 hours, 1 million by morning, and before the day was done, major networks were requesting interviews, investigative reporters were contacting Fulton County records, and legal watchdog organizations began pulling the judge's past case history. At the heart of it all, Nathaniel Brooks remained silent. He did not answer phone calls, did not open his front door for press, did not step outside his modest brick home on the south side, where a U.S. flag fluttered beside a patch of uneven grass. He sat in his worn recliner, the same one he'd owned since the 1980s, the silver star now placed not on his chest, but on a velvet cloth on the table beside him, beside an old wooden frame holding a black and white photo of 6 men in uniform, 5 of whom never made it home. He did not smile at the attention, nor rage at the insult. He simply watched the sky through the window, watched it turn orange, then dark, then pale again. Meanwhile, Judge Carter remained on the bench for the rest of that week, but each day brought new complications. Protesters outside the courthouse with signs that read, "Honor over ego," op-eds from retired generals condemning his behavior, a petition demanding formal censure that crossed 50,000 signatures in less than a day. Court officers whispered in hallways, clerks dodged press calls, and other judges began distancing themselves, referring media inquiries to official statements that said nothing at all. Finally, the pressure reached critical mass, and by Monday, Carter's name was quietly removed from the court schedule. A press release was issued saying he had taken an early retirement for personal reasons, but everyone knew what those reasons were. No one was fooled. Not the legal community, not the public, and certainly not the thousands of veterans who flooded social media with their own stories of being dismissed, disrespected, forgotten. And as the storm built across the country, Nathaniel Brooks remained still, unchanged, as if insulated from the noise. When a local journalist finally managed to catch him outside buying groceries, they asked gently, "Mr. Brooks, do you want to share your side of the story?" And he paused, looked up from the paper bag in his hands, and said only, "There's nothing to explain. The world already saw it, and that was that." No interviews followed, no book deals, no speeches on Sunday talk shows, just silence, the same dignified silence that had filled the courtroom when he removed the silver star, when he stood face to face with a man he once saved, when a nation remembered, however briefly, what sacrifice actually looks like. And in that silence, justice didn't need a verdict. It had already been delivered. Nathaniel Brooks awoke before dawn, as he had every day since he was discharged more than 4 decades ago. The routine etched into his bones, his breath steady, his eyes opening not with urgency but with certainty, as if somewhere deep inside, his body still answered a call long faded from radios and airfields. He moved through the motions. Coffee, window shade, the slow walk down his porch steps, and paused for a moment as the early morning wind brushed against the American flag hanging limply outside, its stars blurred in the dim light. And for a second, he closed his eyes, not in sadness or pride, but in memory. Since the events in the courtroom, his world had shifted without his permission, and though he'd made no statement, refused interviews, and never once raised his voice, the noise around him had only grown louder. Outside his home, people had begun leaving things: notes, flowers, medals, folded flags, even a pair of old combat boots with a card that read, "For the ones who never came home and the ones who carry them still." And Nathaniel, though overwhelmed, never threw any of it away. He simply brought them inside and lined them along the base of the living room wall like ghosts standing watch. The media still knocked occasionally, though less now that the story had spiraled beyond them. Judge Carter's name had been formally removed from the state's judicial registry. A new ethics board had been convened, and national veteran organizations had announced a day of recognition in Nathaniel's name, though he had politely declined the invitation to attend. What they didn't understand, what they perhaps couldn't, was that Nathaniel Brooks had never sought recognition, never craved applause or vindication. He had fought to keep people alive, and now, all these years later, he was still fighting to keep the memory of those who didn't survive from being distorted by noise and ego. Meanwhile, the courtroom footage had reached Congress. An active-duty Marine Corps colonel gave a testimony on the matter during a public ethics hearing, holding up a printed still of the moment Nathaniel removed his silver star and saying, If this doesn't move you, you don't understand what it means to serve. Across social media, thousands of veterans began sharing their own stories using the hashtag #StandForBrooks, recounting moments when their service had been overlooked, their experiences minimized, their sacrifices dismissed by systems more interested in decorum than truth. But for Nathaniel, the storm beyond his door remained distant, something he acknowledged but didn't indulge. His focus remained the same as it had always been: honor, duty, quiet dignity. One evening, his neighbor's daughter, a teenage girl named Kiara, knocked gently on his front door with a homemade drawing in her hand, a crayon portrait of Nathaniel in his blazer, standing in front of the courthouse, the silver star shining like a sun. And when she handed it to him, she whispered, "My teacher said you changed what justice means." And he smiled, just barely, and replied, "I didn't change anything, child. I just didn't let them forget." The following Sunday, Nathaniel took his first walk through the neighborhood since the hearing. People greeted him, some waved silently, others placed hands over hearts, but no one intruded, no one crowded him. There was a quiet reverence in the air, like a church procession without music. He walked past a mural newly painted on the brick wall of the community center, an image of him seated on the witness stand, the silver star on the table, and General Ellison standing behind him like a guardian spirit. Beneath it were the words, "Dignity is not worn, it is carried." Nathaniel stood before it for a long time, his cane lightly tapping the concrete as he shifted his weight, and though he said nothing aloud, something in his posture softened, as though a burden had been slightly eased. But perhaps the most powerful moment came weeks later, at a Veterans Roundtable in Washington, D.C., when a young newly appointed federal judge, himself a black former Navy officer, opened his remarks not with a quote from the Constitution, but with a sentence that reverberated far beyond the chamber. "Before I render any ruling, I remember Nathaniel Brooks placing a silver star on a witness stand and saying nothing at all." The room fell still, and a new kind of justice, one born not from gavel or robe, but from memory and moral clarity, was allowed into the conversation. Nathaniel never knew about the quote, never saw the video clips, never watched the hearings. He simply remained in his home, living with the same discipline he always had, his days filled with quiet, his nights filled with memory. The silver star now rested in a glass case in the center of his mantle, not as a display, but as a reminder, not of what he did, but of what he refused to let be taken from him. And in the gentle hum of his silent house, where the news had been replaced by birdsong and the sound of wind against brick, Nathaniel Brooks became a symbol, not because he raised his voice, but because in the face of authority, he refused to lower his head. The day had started like any other, sunlight pressing against the wool-worn blinds of Nathaniel Brooks's living room, the scent of percolated coffee drifting through the quiet stillness of a house that had learned how to carry silence like folded linen. But just after noon, a knock sounded at the door, not tentative like the reporters or overly eager like the local students who sometimes brought cards, but firm, measured, a knock that carried intent. Nathaniel rose slowly from his recliner, the silver star gleaming faintly from its place beneath glass on the mantel as he passed by, the only witness to what lay ahead. And when he opened the door, he was met by a sharply dressed woman in a dark tailored suit with a badge hanging from a leather wallet held loosely in her hand. She introduced herself as Special Agent Valerie Monroe, Department of Justice, and explained that she wasn't here about the judge or the court or even the footage that had gone viral, but rather about a deeper investigation quietly unfolding, one that concerned judicial abuse, racial profiling in court proceedings, and the systemic silencing of military veterans, particularly veterans of color. Nathaniel said nothing for a long moment, then stepped aside, letting her in not because he trusted her, but because something in her eyes suggested she knew what it meant to fight silently inside systems built to forget you. She walked into the living room, and her eyes immediately settled on the silver star, her lips parting ever so slightly in recognition. And though she said nothing, the shift in her posture said everything. Respect, awareness, restraint. She sat when he gestured, her back straight but not stiff, and then began to ask questions, not about what had been recorded, but about what had not. Previous cases Nathaniel might have witnessed in that courtroom, patterns of behavior from Judge Carter that may not have been captured by cameras, but had still wounded, still degraded. Nathaniel answered in pieces, carefully, not because he was hiding anything, but because he refused to speak unless he was sure the words would be used to build something instead of being shelved and forgotten, like so many other testimonies. As he spoke, Agent Monroe took notes by hand, her pen moving slowly across the pages of a thick, leather-bound notebook. Not tapping on a laptop, not typing into a phone, because some truths, she said, are too sacred to be filtered through screens. The conversation lasted hours, moving from legalities to memories, from frustration to quiet pride, and when Nathaniel recounted the moment in the courtroom when he was told to remove his medal, he didn't describe it as anger or shame, but simply as a moment of dislocation, as if someone had tried to unhook him from history itself. He said it felt less like being silenced and more like watching someone try to erase a gravestone with a dry cloth. And Agent Monroe, though trained to maintain professional detachment, swallowed hard before writing those exact words in full. Eventually, the conversation slowed, not because they were done, but because Nathaniel had said all that needed saying, and when she stood to leave, she turned to face the medal one more time and said quietly, "This case won't just be about a judge anymore. It's about what kind of country we are when no one's watching." And Nathaniel nodded once, the smallest gesture carrying the weight of a lifetime. As she stepped out into the late afternoon light, she paused and looked back, almost asking permission to say one more thing, and when he gave a slight tilt of his head, she said, "I joined the DOJ because of my father. He served too, but he never talked about it. He just sat in his chair at the end of every day like you do now. I think he was carrying ghosts he didn't know how to name." And Nathaniel replied, "That's how most of us carry them, not to forget, just to keep them from slipping away completely." And then he closed the door gently behind her, not with finality, but with purpose. Inside the house, everything looked the same. The old photographs, the shelf of faded books, the coffee mug still half full beside the chair. But something had shifted, a current now running beneath the floorboards, a slow awakening of something long buried but never lost. And across town, Agent Monroe entered a secure government building, passed through 2 layers of clearance, and laid her notebook on a conference table already filled with other reports, her pages resting atop a growing mountain of names, transcripts, dates, patterns, testimonies, pieces of a puzzle that was no longer just about a courtroom insult, but about how easily systems forget the very people they were built to honor. Meanwhile, Nathaniel returned to his chair, sat slowly, looked out the window as the wind moved the flag once again, and though his face remained still, his right hand gently tapped the armrest, a rhythm only he knew, a beat from another time, another war, another fire. And outside, for the first time in weeks, the sky began to shift. Clouds parting just slightly, allowing a single shaft of light to fall across the mantel, catching the silver star beneath the glass until it glowed softly in the quiet of the room, not loudly, not boastfully, but enough for memory to lean into and enough for justice to find its way home. Weeks passed, and the public firestorm had begun to recede into the familiar rhythm of political cycles and social media churn, but in one place it had only just begun to smolder. Howard University School of Law, where a national symposium on judicial ethics and veterans' rights was being held in honor of reform, sweeping through courtrooms after a series of high-profile cases, one of which was never officially named, but lived in the undercurrent of every panel, every hallway whisper, every solemn nod from professors who had once worn uniforms themselves. The main lecture hall was packed beyond capacity, students sitting on stairs, veterans standing in the back, and in the front row sat Agent Valerie Monroe, her notebook still full from that long afternoon with Nathaniel Brooks, and beside her was a single empty seat, intentionally left unclaimed, with nothing but a folded program resting on it, its front printed with the image of a folded flag beneath the words, "When justice forgets honor, honor reminds justice." At the podium stood the keynote speaker, a decorated appellate judge from California, himself a former JAG officer, a man known not for fiery speeches but for surgical precision in both law and language. And as he looked out over the audience, he said something that would be quoted for years after. "There are moments when silence is louder than any gavel, when an act of quiet dignity in one courtroom cracks the foundation of injustice in all others. I will not name the man today. He does not want to be named. But I will tell you what he did. He obeyed the law. He respected the court. And he laid a silver star on the witness stand like a man placing a folded flag on a coffin. Not for applause, not for anger, but to remind us that memory, when dishonored, will rise in ways we cannot contain. The room didn't erupt in cheers. Instead, it fell into a reverent hush, the kind that speaks louder than clapping. And one by one, people began to rise, not in ovation, but in quiet solidarity, echoing the moment in that Atlanta courtroom as if it were happening again, as if time itself had folded to remember what it dared not forget. After the symposium, Valerie walked out into the courtyard where the winter sun cast long shadows across the memorial stones dedicated to alumni who had served. And she sat on a bench beneath a tree whose leaves had all but disappeared, pulling from her bag a small envelope she hadn't dared open until now, a letter written by Nathaniel Brooks in his own hand, sent days after their conversation, sealed with a single piece of tape and no return address. Inside it, 3 short paragraphs written in blocky script, the kind shaped more by muscle memory than elegance. He wrote, "You asked what made me sit silent instead of protest. I didn't sit because I had no fight left. I sat because some battles are won by not rising to meet a man where he stands, but by forcing him to stand alone. People forget what medals mean. They think they're permission to speak. They're not. They're reminders to carry the ones who can't anymore." She read it twice, then folded it slowly and returned it to her coat pocket, not just as a letter, but as a compass, an ethical north she intended to follow for the rest of her career. Across the city, meanwhile, Nathaniel sat on the edge of his porch as children rode bicycles up and down the sidewalk, their laughter filling the air like a tune from a different life. And though he didn't engage, didn't wave or smile, he watched them with the soft gaze of a man who understood how easily the world forgets what it's been given, and how sacred it is when peace is no longer questioned. His neighbor, Mr. Lester, a retired mail carrier, shuffled over and offered him a folded newspaper with a front-page headline, "Unspoken Hero Inspires New Code of Ethics for Federal Judges." Nathaniel glanced at it, then looked away, uninterested in being mythologized, unwilling to be turned into symbol when all he'd wanted was respect. Not fame, not legacy, just dignity. Mr. Lester sat beside him on the steps and said, "They talk about you like you're a monument now," and Nathaniel replied, "Monuments don't bleed." And then neither of them spoke for several minutes, content to let the wind carry the truth between them. Back at the university, the keynote speaker was finishing a final roundtable with a group of law students when one asked, "How do we know when to speak and when to be silent?" And the judge paused, then said, "You watch who gets asked to remove their truth just to be heard. That's when you speak. That's when you don't sit down." And across the campus, someone spray-painted the words, "Honor does not whisper," on the side of a brick wall, not as vandalism, but as tribute. And though no one would ever find a video of Nathaniel Brooks giving a speech, shaking hands, or accepting any public award, he was being quoted in military academies, studied in law schools, discussed in theology classrooms, not because of what he said, but because he never raised his voice. And still, the nation listened, for every man who had been asked to strip off a part of himself to be heard, for every woman whose credentials had been dismissed for not fitting a courtroom's optics, for every veteran told that their sacrifice mattered only when convenient. The image of Nathaniel laying down his silver star was becoming a form of civil scripture, not of protest, not of noise, but of stillness that refused to be diminished. And in the quiet corners of America, where justice still battled formality, people were beginning to ask different questions, not just about laws, but about how we honor the ones who live by them, even when the law forgot to honor them back. On a chilly Thursday morning, as frost still clung to the edges of the mailbox and the breath from Nathaniel Brooks's lungs ghosted visibly in the air, a small, unmarked envelope appeared on his front porch, tucked beneath the faded welcome mat, like a secret left by time itself. There was no stamp, no sender, only his name written in neat, steady penmanship that looked like it came from someone who learned to write before cursive was optional. Inside was a single sheet of thick paper, folded once with a simple message. "You kept your promise. Thank you for carrying us." There was no signature, but as Nathaniel sat with it at his kitchen table, the steam from his coffee drifting lazily upward, he knew exactly who had written it, or at least what kind of person had. Someone who had seen the inside of a foxhole or the underbelly of a medevac chopper. Someone who knew what it meant to hold a man's name in your head long after his body had disappeared into smoke and silence. He read the line again, not aloud, not with his lips, but with the quiet nod of recognition that only veterans truly understand. And then he folded it back up and placed it inside an old shoebox already filled with similar messages, ones he had never asked for but kept anyway, not because he needed the praise, but because he knew there would be a time, maybe not now, maybe not even in his lifetime, when someone else might need to see them to believe that dignity still left footprints. Across town, in a modest VA office on Auburn Avenue, an administrator named Danya Reeves was assembling a proposal that would shift how courtrooms trained their staff to interact with veterans, especially those whose service had intersected with systemic injustice. Her idea was simple. Not a new law, not a political campaign, just a program, a room in every courthouse called the Flag Room, where veterans who were about to testify could sit for a few minutes, alone, in silence, in the company of folded flags and quiet memory, a space that said, "We know who you are before you speak." And though the county board dismissed it at first as unnecessary, by the time the Fifth City sent in letters requesting to adopt the pilot, the silence became its own endorsement. Nathaniel knew none of this. Not directly, though bits and pieces filtered in through conversations with neighbors, letters from strangers, or short segments he caught when his TV flickered to life during the 6 o'clock news. He'd always turn the volume down, never watching for more than a few minutes, but sometimes, when the faces on screen reminded him of old friends, he'd stop, just for a moment, just long enough to let the ache rise and pass. But what he did notice, what made him pause longer than any broadcast, was the growing number of small flags showing up in windows around his neighborhood. Not flashy, not the kind waved during parades, but modest ones, folded neatly, pressed behind glass, often beside black and white photographs, or yellowed documents from old enlistments, as if people had been waiting for a reason to remember, and now they had one. It was subtle at first, 2 houses on his block, then 4, then 10, and by the end of the month, nearly every window on his street bore some quiet symbol of service, and though no one said it aloud, they all knew who had inspired it. Nathaniel, for his part, never acknowledged the flags directly, never commented or nodded or thanked anyone, but every morning he'd pass each one on his slow walk to the corner store, and with each flag, he'd adjust his posture just slightly straighter, just enough to feel his spine remember the man he once was and still somehow remained. And then came the letter from Arlington, the official one, printed on thick cream paper, bearing the seal of the Department of the Army and signed by a major general, offering him the chance to have his story included in a new exhibit at the National Museum of the United States Army, not as a display of combat, but of moral courage, a term rarely used and even more rarely understood. They wanted to feature his silver star, not the act that earned it, but the moment he laid it down, the courtroom still frame that had now become an icon of ethical resistance. They asked if he would donate the medal to be preserved behind glass with his permission and words, and Nathaniel took days to respond. Not because he was undecided, but because he knew that once he gave it up, he was giving it back. Not to the system, not to the law, but to history. In the end, he agreed, but only under one condition, that the display include no photograph of him, only the medal, the transcript of the judge's words, and a quote from one of the anonymous letters he had received. Silence does not mean surrender. It means we are listening for something worth standing for. The museum accepted without hesitation, and 3 months later, beneath lights designed to prevent fading, the silver star sat inside a clear case, suspended over a dark velvet backing, and in front of it, day after day, people stopped. School children, tourists, retired soldiers with quiet eyes and tired knees. Some stood in silence, others whispered, but all left just a little more aware than they had been before. Back in Atlanta, Nathaniel placed a simple cloth where the medal had once rested on his mantle, not to fill the space, but to acknowledge its absence. And above it, he hung a small hand-stitched flag made by Kiara, the neighbor girl who had spent weeks sewing it in secret with her grandmother. It wasn't perfect. The stitches wavered, the stars uneven, but when he looked at it, he smiled for the first time in days, because it was honest, and that was all he'd ever wanted from anyone. He sat back in his chair, the late afternoon sun pouring through the blinds, casting lines across the floor like the stripes of an old flag worn thin from too much wind. And for a moment, Nathaniel Brooks allowed himself the rare luxury of stillness, not because he had nothing to fight, but because for the first time in a long time, he no longer had to do it alone. It was deep in December when the call came, Not on a cell phone, not through the buzz of a news alert or a reporter seeking a comment, but through the landline Nathaniel Brooks had refused to disconnect, even as technology marched forward without asking permission. A device that rang rarely, mostly for church bulletins or the occasional wrong number. But that morning, it broke the quiet with a tone sharp enough to make him pause mid-step between the kitchen and the front room, where Kiara's stitched flag still hung in place of the silver star, now resting in a museum 2 states away. He picked up the phone slowly, his joints stiff with cold, the old ache in his shoulder flaring just slightly with the motion, and he answered with the same voice he always had, measured, cautious, unconcerned with speed. And on the other end came a voice he didn't recognize at first. Young, but calm, professional, but not cold, and she introduced herself as Captain Denise Alvarez, a public liaison officer working with the Presidential Commission on Veteran Affairs, and she explained carefully that the President of the United States had been briefed on the impact of his courtroom moment, that his name had come up not just in military reports or think tank briefs, but in ethics seminars, international law discussions, and even sermon footnotes from pastors trying to teach something about dignity beyond dogma. She said that the White House would like to extend an invitation, not a ceremony, not a medal, not a headline, but a simple, private meeting to thank him personally, not for the war, not for the rescue in Vietnam, but for reminding the country what honor looks like in silence. Nathaniel said nothing for a long beat, so long that Captain Alvarez asked gently if he was still on the line, and he finally answered with only 4 words, "I'll need to think." And after a polite goodbye, he hung up and stared at the receiver for a few moments more, his thoughts already far away, not at the White House, but back at that courtroom, at the moment his fingers slipped behind the pin of his silver star, the click of metal against wood louder than any judge's gavel. He didn't tell anyone about the call that day, not Kiara, not Mr. Lester, not even the young pastor who visited occasionally and always brought sweet tea and too many questions. Instead, he sat by the window and watched the wind knock dried leaves across the sidewalk, watched a boy in a red hoodie ride his bicycle in circles near the edge of the curb, watched the world remain completely unaware that sometimes history only shifts when no one notices it happening. It wasn't until the second call came, this time from General Marcus Ellison himself, that Nathaniel's expression changed, because that voice, deep and steady and unmistakable, greeted him not with formality, but with quiet brotherhood, calling him Sergeant Brooks, like it was still 1970, and they had just pulled each other from the mouth of a jungle burning with rotor blades and rifle fire. General Ellison said he had spoken to the president directly, that the meeting would be short, respectful, private. No press, no photos, no flags. Just a conversation between a man who spoke softly and a nation that needed to learn how to listen. Nathaniel didn't answer immediately, but this time when he did, he said, "If you'll stand beside me, I'll come." And that was that. No further details exchanged, just the kind of pact soldiers make without needing to explain the weight behind it. Over the next 2 weeks, arrangements were made quietly. No motorcade, no limousine, just a government sedan driven by a young Army lieutenant who saluted awkwardly and called Nathaniel Sir too many times. Kiara waved from the sidewalk, holding a small hand-painted sign that read, "Come back soon, we'll keep the flag warm." And Nathaniel smiled at her, a small, almost imperceptible curve of the mouth that carried more thanks than any speech he could have given. The flight to D.C. was uneventful, the air crisp and dry when they landed, the Capitol lit like a beacon in the dark as the car drove silently toward Pennsylvania Avenue. When he entered the West Wing through a side entrance, escorted by General Ellison himself, there were no cameras, only quiet nods from staffers who somehow knew who he was without needing to be told. And when he finally stepped into the Oval Office, it was smaller than he imagined, more intimate, the desk large but not imposing, the flags on either side still, and behind the desk stood the president, not with outstretched hand, but with both palms open, a gesture that said, "I receive, I do not command." Nathaniel approached without hurry, without hesitation, and when they shook hands, the president looked him in the eye and said, "You didn't just remind us how to honor our heroes. You reminded us how we dishonor them without even knowing it." And Nathaniel, never one for flattery, responded simply, "Sometimes all a man has left is the silence he chooses not to break." And for a moment, neither of them spoke further. The room filled not with history or ceremony, but with something older, understanding without ego. The meeting lasted 20 minutes, and when it ended, Nathaniel was offered a small leather box, not an award, but a gift. Inside was a folded American flag flown over the Capitol in his honor, along with a handwritten note: "You never raised your voice, so now the country is raising its own." He accepted it not with pride, but with respect. And as he turned to leave, the president asked softly, "Is there anything we can do for you?" And Nathaniel paused, then said, "Make sure the next man wearing a medal doesn't have to choose between wearing it and being heard." And then he left the room, his shoulders square, his steps even, walking not like a man receiving tribute, but like a man returning home. Nathaniel Brooks didn't fly back to Atlanta. He took the train, not out of preference or nostalgia, but because it gave him time to sit still and let the hum of the tracks smooth out the noise that followed him from the White House to Union Station. Time to watch the country pass by through scratched windows and long stretches of silence. Time to feel the weight of the folded flag in the leather case resting beside him on the seat, like a companion that didn't ask questions. The train car was mostly empty, just a few commuters and one or two quiet college kids staring at screens. And for most of the ride, no one noticed him. Just an older black man in a weathered wool coat, hands folded, posture disciplined, his eyes watching not what was outside the window, but what lived somewhere far beyond it. It wasn't until Richmond that someone approached him, a young man, maybe early 20s, jeans frayed at the knee, wearing a hoodie from a state university and earbuds slung around his neck like medals of his own generation. And he paused by Nathaniel's row for a long second before asking, with the kind of hesitation that suggested he already knew the answer, "Sir, are you him?" And Nathaniel turned his head slightly, one eyebrow raised but no offense taken. And after a beat he replied, "I'm someone, yeah." And the boy smiled nervously and said, "I saw the clip. In my ethics class. They played it twice." And Nathaniel didn't smile, but he didn't look away either. And the boy added, "They said it changed the way some judges get trained now, that there's a checklist, that your moment is one of the case studies." And at that, Nathaniel blinked slowly, not because he was surprised, but because there was something almost surreal about becoming a lesson in a textbook for simply not backing down when asked to surrender something sacred. The boy didn't sit down, just stood there with his hands in his hoodie pocket and said, "I'm studying law and history. I guess now those two go together." And Nathaniel, his voice low but steady, said, "They always did. People just forgot who writes both." And the boy nodded like he understood, even if he didn't fully yet. And then he said thank you, not like a fan, but like a witness, and returned to his seat. The rest of the trip passed quietly, Nathaniel occasionally shifting to stretch his knees, the rhythm of the train syncing with his breath, until the arrival into Atlanta felt less like a return and more like a re-entry into a place that had changed in subtle ways since he had last stepped away. When he exited the station, there was no welcoming crowd, no cameras, no banners. Just Kiara standing beside her grandmother, holding a thermos of hot tea and a homemade sign that read, "We kept the seat warm." Nathaniel didn't speak, just touched the brim of his hat and took the tea with both hands, warming his fingers against the metal, like he'd once done near the side of a cold helicopter in the jungle at dawn. They walked home together, Kiara telling stories about how the neighborhood had started putting up little brass nameplates under each window flag, including one on their own home, reading, "We remember because you stayed silent." Nathaniel said nothing, but his hand tightened slightly on the flag case at his side. Not possessive, not protective, just grateful. That night, after the tea had cooled and the porch light was off, Nathaniel opened a drawer he hadn't touched in years, pulled out a small black notebook, worn thin at the spine, and inside were names. Just names, last and first, scribbled in faded pencil and sometimes smudged by time or tear, and he flipped to the back where the pages were still blank, and he wrote Ellison, Monroe, Alvarez, Kiara, the boy on the train. And then he closed the notebook gently and returned it to the drawer, because for him, remembering wasn't about the past. It was about anchoring the present to something heavier than opinion. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, and in one of the windows across the street, a new flag had appeared. Not folded, not hidden, just gently waving in the moonlight, as if nodding in quiet approval to the man sitting behind the glass who had once been asked to take his honor off and had chosen instead to make the whole country look at what it meant. It arrived on a Thursday in an envelope that had been carefully hand-addressed and sealed with 2 overlapping stamps, as if the sender wasn't sure a single one would be enough to carry the weight of what was inside. Nathaniel Brooks found it wedged beneath a circular for roofing repairs and a utility bill, its cream-colored surface standing out like something from another time, and when he turned it over and saw the return address, a name he didn't recognize, from a small town in North Carolina. He almost placed it aside for later, but something about the way his name was written on the front made him pause, each letter shaped with care, not rushed or scribbled, but deliberate. He sat down in his armchair, the folded flag still displayed above the mantel where the silver star had once rested, and opened the envelope slowly, sliding out a single sheet of stationery lined with faint blue borders and faintly scented with lavender. The handwriting was elegant, the ink slightly uneven, and the letter began simply, "Mr. Brooks, I believe you met my son on the train to Atlanta. He told me about your conversation, and I felt compelled to write, though I wasn't sure I had the right to." Nathaniel's eyes scanned the lines carefully, his breath steady, not yet emotional, just focused. The woman continued, "He's always been quiet, but after that trip, something in him shifted. He came home and asked to rewatch the clip they'd seen in class. He printed out a photo of you, just your back, standing at the witness stand, with that medal beside the microphone. He pinned it on the wall next to his desk. He told me, that's what strength looks like when it doesn't need to yell." Nathaniel exhaled once through his nose, the sound low and slow, and he kept reading. "He's seen my father's medals before, his grandfather, but he never really asked about them until now. He never asked why Papa never talked about the war, or why there's a shadow behind his eyes in every photo. But now he's asking, and more than that, he's listening." She wrote of how her son had applied for an internship at the local public defender's office, how he had said he wanted to be in the room where dignity gets debated, and how, when she asked him what that meant, he said, "I want to be the kind of lawyer who would have stood up like that general did, even if I didn't wear a uniform." Nathaniel paused, set the letter down in his lap, and stared at the window for a while, at the leafless tree outside, at the quiet sky, and then picked it back up. The letter closed with a final paragraph. "I just wanted to say thank you, not for saving him, but for showing him that silence can be louder than applause. He saw in you a kind of manhood that doesn't demand attention, just carries truth like a folded flag. I hope one day, if he has to stand up for someone, he'll remember the way you stood without saying a word." She signed it simply, "With respect, Angela Carter." And it was in that moment, reading her last name, that a quiet shock spread through Nathaniel's chest, like a ripple in still water, because he realized who she must be, the wife, or perhaps ex-wife, of Judge William Carter, the very man who had ordered him to remove his medal, the very man whose voice had triggered the moment the country now saw as a turning point. He read her name again, and something unfamiliar flickered behind his eyes. Not anger, not bitterness, but a kind of complex stillness, a deep human ache for the way people break and bend and grow without ever knowing the seeds of their change were planted by something they once dismissed. He folded the letter carefully, returned it to the envelope, and placed it on the small wooden table near the front door, beside Kiara's latest drawing and a worn copy of the Army's Code of Conduct Manual from 1969. Outside, the wind picked up and a neighbor's flag rustled faintly in its frame, the sound like breath on a memory. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair and let the weight of the moment settle in. Not just the boy's awakening or the mother's words, but the realization that even those tied to the very source of his humiliation were now quietly shifting in his direction, not to worship him, not to erase the past, but to walk toward a better understanding of what that past had cost. In that understanding, he found no victory, no triumph, just a quiet affirmation that maybe this time silence had not gone unnoticed, and maybe this time it had done more than echo. It had landed, grown roots, and begun to speak in voices he would never meet, in rooms he would never enter, in decisions yet to be made. And as dusk settled over the neighborhood and porch lights blinked on like soft sentinels across the block, Nathaniel closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to remember. Not the moment in court, not the applause or the standing ovation, but the smell of wet boots, the thud of helicopter blades, the sound of a friend's voice calling his name before everything went quiet and left him holding memory like a burning fuse. And he whispered under his breath to no one, to everyone, "I didn't change the world, I just didn't let it change me." Spring arrived early in Atlanta that year, not with dramatic bloom or fanfare, but with the soft persistence of green pushing through concrete cracks and petals clinging stubbornly to air heavy with pollen and memory. Nathaniel Brooks noticed the shift not in the trees or the skies, but in the way people passed by his porch, in the quiet nods from strangers, in the slower pace of those who once hurried, in the children who now glanced at his house like it was part of something sacred. He didn't acknowledge most of it, didn't respond with stories or head shakes or knowing smiles. He simply sat in his usual place, same chair, same rhythm, same posture. Only now, there was a small frame beside him, containing not a photo, but a printed line from that mother's letter. Silence can be louder than applause. It rested just beneath the edge of the folded flag from the White House, both of them positioned so they faced out, not toward him, but toward the street, as if they were no longer his to keep but his to share. The silver star remained in the museum, untouched, but its presence never left the house. He felt it in the air, in the warmth of the wood beneath his fingers, in the way Kiara had once drawn it with rays of light bursting from its center as if it were the sun itself. He didn't wear it again, not out of defiance, not because he was bitter, but because something deeper had settled inside him. A truth he could never fully articulate, that the metal had already done what it needed to do, and now it lived not on his chest, but in the eyes of those who saw him differently, in the voices of law students quoting his stillness, in the policies reshaped behind closed doors by people who no longer saw veterans as props, but as living witnesses to the cost of ignoring dignity. One afternoon, a package arrived from the museum, not with fanfare, not with press, but with a note that read, "A copy for you, since the original now speaks for itself." Inside was a replica of the exhibit's plaque, etched with the quote he had chosen, and beneath it, a small inscription, donated by Sergeant Nathaniel Brooks, who did not speak, but who changed what a courtroom hears. He placed it on the wall above the coat rack, beneath an old army jacket he hadn't worn in decades, and beside it, he tacked a photograph taken without his knowledge, captured by Kiara on her disposable camera from the sidewalk the day he returned from D.C. He was mid-step, not looking at the lens, his hand on the handle of the door, his face unreadable, but the flag in his other hand catching the light just enough to shimmer like a breath being held. He kept that photo there not because he liked it, but because it reminded him of something Ellison once said. Sometimes legacy is not what you say, but what people say when they think you've left the room. That legacy lived on now in ways Nathaniel never expected. Agent Monroe had since been promoted and was now heading a national initiative to audit judicial practices involving veterans. And though Nathaniel had declined to be interviewed for the program, she still wrote to him every few weeks, a postcard, a quote, once even a photo of her father in uniform that she'd never shared with anyone else. Captioned simply, "I think he would have stood too." Letters from strangers kept coming, some from soldiers, some from civilians, some from high school teachers who had changed their lesson plans. One even from a federal judge who confessed that after seeing the clip, he had walked into his chambers, removed his robe, and sat with a veteran defendant in silence for 5 minutes before the hearing began. Just to listen, just to let the man be seen. Nathaniel read every letter, kept most, threw away none, though he never replied. He believed some things are best answered by action, not ink. In the final days of spring, Kiara hosted a school art show in the community center gymnasium, and she begged Nathaniel to attend, not as a guest of honor, just as someone who liked drawings. And after 3 refusals, he finally agreed. The gym buzzed with children and exhausted parents, and the smell of popcorn and finger paint. And tucked near the back was Kiara's exhibit, a collage of courtroom sketches, metal drawings, folded flags, and in the center, a bold caption, "What strength looks like when it's quiet." Nathaniel didn't speak, didn't smile, didn't offer critique. He simply placed his hand lightly on her shoulder, and that was enough. Later that night, as he sat back on his porch beneath a sky slowly losing its blue, he thought about all the men he'd known, those who'd shouted, those who'd wept, those who died, and those who never said a word, but whose silence told entire histories. He thought of the boy on the train, of Agent Monroe's father, of the judge who had never apologized, and of the woman who sent a letter with her son's newfound clarity tucked inside each line. He thought of the country, not as it was or claimed to be, but as it could become if enough people refused to let their silence be mistaken for absence. And then he closed his eyes, not in sadness, not even in peace, but in a long, slow breath that felt like conclusion, like understanding, like the last line of a story that didn't need an ending. Because in truth, it had never really been about him, never about the medal or the courtroom or the headlines. It had always been about what he refused to let them take. Not the silver star, but what it stood for. A man seated in full view who had once been told to remove his dignity before speaking, and who instead chose to remove the illusion that power has the final word. He never raised his voice. He never demanded respect. And yet, his silence shook the very walls of a courtroom, and his quiet refusal to surrender his dignity became louder than any verdict. Nathaniel Brooks reminded us that true honor doesn't need to be worn on a chest to be seen. It lives in the choices we make when no one expects us to stand. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to remember what dignity looks like. Drop a comment below. Have you ever witnessed quiet strength like this in your own life? And don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow us for more stories that reveal the power of truth, justice, and the human spirit. Because sometimes, all it takes is one silent man to make the whole world listen.